Alright everybody, we're still on Roman numeral 8. We're trying to work our way through this one. This is our third video for Roman numeral 8, but that's okay. I'm at Roman numeral 8, letter I. Roman numeral 8, letter I. African slave traders. Now by African slave traders, what I'm referring to are African people who sell slaves. Okay, the African people who are slave traders. Okay, they are a vital part of this equation. Okay, Europeans cannot go into the continent of Africa and harvest or collect a group of people to enslave and export to the Americas. Okay, they have to buy them. They could not survive in Africa. There are tropical diseases that Europeans were not immune to. Okay, malaria in particular. Africans had developed immunities to these diseases, but Europeans, they were deadly diseases. Okay, so what the Europeans have to do in order to acquire slaves is they have to make contact with an African society, okay, and negotiate a trade. Okay, they usually would meet on the beach. Europeans couldn't hardly get in even into the continent a mile or two because of the tropical diseases. They didn't get into the jungle, which is much of what we're talking about in terms of land terrain. They would meet up with some folks. They would negotiate a trade, something for slaves. Anybody want to guess what that something was? Yes, correct. It was usually guns and alcohol. Okay, guns and or alcohol, I should say. And the two groups would meet. The European slave traders would meet with African slave traders. They would negotiate a certain number of slaves in exchange for a certain number of guns. Usually the guns were given up front because it would make acquiring slaves even easier. The African traders would be given the guns. They would go into the forest, use the guns to collect the slaves, and return them to the beach, where the Europeans would, after kind of looking them over, inspecting them to make sure that they're all healthy, would then load them onto their ships and take them to the Americas. Okay, this was not a matter of kidnap. That's a myth that sometimes people come up with about when we talk about the slave trade. Europeans came and kidnapped Africans and took them into slavery. That's really not true. They bought Africans. Okay, they bought them from other Africans. Now, the problem with this kind of thinking is in our modern perception of Africans. We see African folks today as a group. Okay, it's really not. African people throughout history and still today are many groups, hundreds of different groups. Okay, these different groups go to war with each other. These different groups negotiate with each other. These different groups deal with each other in various ways, but they are never one people. Okay, there is not a country called Africa. There is not a language called African. There is not a culture called African in general. Okay, there are lots and lots of different Africas, and there are lots and lots of different Africans. Okay, so that's the one myth that that Europeans came and kidnapped African folks and enslaved them. No, they bought them. Okay, they were sold by other African groups. Now the other myth that we hear sometimes, if you will, kind of the redneck myth sometimes you hear, is that African folks were selling their brothers and sisters into slavery. Obviously that's not true either. They were selling their enemies, or they were selling people outside of their society for the most part as as slaves. Okay, it's different if you think about it in terms of those realities, because that's just the truth of it. You or I or anyone else, we're not going to sell our loved ones into slavery. We're not going to do that by any stretch of imagination. However, if we think about how we feel about those people of our society, our kinds of folks, Americans if you will, as opposed to people from other societies, we think about them differently, don't we? We don't, hold outside people outside of our society in the same regard as we hold for our own people. Now, not saying that we'd sell anybody. I'm not selling anybody ever, but that was kind of the concept that Africans had as they sold slaves. They weren't selling their people. They weren't selling Africans in their mind because they didn't think of themselves as Africans. They thought of themselves as Fon or Mindi or Mandinka or Bantu or Hutu or Fanti or Asante. Okay, they see themselves as their ethnic group, as their smaller ethnic group, and everybody else is outside that and potentially an enemy to them. Okay, so the reality was that African slave traders sold Africans to Europeans, but that doesn't mean they're selling their people. That did not really happen. The idea that African people are one people came about in the 20th century. Okay, if you were to go back to the 16th century and ask some folks on the continent of Africa, who are you? They wouldn't say they're Africans. They would say that they were, Iwe or Fon or Eek or something like that. These are all different ethnic groups in Africa. All right, well, I think I've covered that. All right, now the Middle Passage, letter J. Middle Passage is the name given to that voyage that African slaves took to the Americas. This was a very, very deadly, very, very sad part in history. Usually the folks were stripped naked on the beach. Then they were loaded onto the ships where they were given just enough room to lie down. They were chained together on multiple decks of the ship, and that's where they would remain for several weeks, 3 or more weeks, as they made their passage across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, usually on a daily basis, the people were brought up in groups to the deck to get fresh air and to be cleaned. Otherwise, they were lying on these decks chained to each other with very little mobility. They're stripped of every possession they owned. They were stripped of, in the minds of the Europeans anyway, they were stripped of their Africanness. However, that did not happen, because when we see these groups come to the Americas, we find that African culture emerges in the Americas. For example, there are some words in the English language that came straight from Nigeria, like okra. Okra is a crop, and the word okra came from Nigeria. There are words in the English language that came straight from Central Africa, Angola. For example, gumbo. Okay, these are elements of African culture that still survive. There's a musical instrument that Africans brought with them. They didn't actually bring it with them. They brought the knowledge of how to make the instrument with them, and that is the banjo. Okay, now you don't hardly at all think of the banjo as anything representing African America today. However, the banjo is an African American instrument that was made in Africa before it ever came here and became part of country or hillbilly type music. Okay, quite different, isn't it? So when Africans come to America, they are not totally stripped of who they are. They bring their culture with them, at least to certain extents. Okay, all right. So that Middle Passage, if the folks survived that Middle Passage, which was on these ships, they were rampant with disease. This was a very, very miserable existence for these 3 weeks or so. Not that all of slavery isn't miserable, but this is especially miserable. And if they arrive, and survive and get healthy and live in the Americas, then they find themselves living as plantation laborers for the rest of their life, for the most part. Okay. Letter J. Letter K. Justification. Now, justification. Why is this okay? That's what I mean. What do the Europeans say that this is okay? Because there were people who were against it from the very beginning. The idea of buying and selling human beings, the slave trade. There were opponents from the very beginning. Now, these European slave traders said that they had 2 reasons why this was okay. Reason number 1 was they said that slavery had always been a part of African culture, and they were correct in that. That doesn't make it okay, There are all kinds of parts of our modern culture that have been around forever, but that doesn't make them okay. Reason number 2 is, this is great, I love this one. They said that they were introducing these folks to Christianity. They were teaching them about Jesus and getting them saved so they can go to heaven, and then enslaving them and working them till they die. I guess that sounds like the way Jesus would do it, maybe. Okay, that's the justification. Make sure you know those 2. That is the end of Roman numeral 8.